The wind cut through the empty street like a blade when a furious white man stormed toward a shivering black woman curled on the frozen sidewalk. His voice exploded before she could even breathe. "What the hell do you think you're doing with my daughter? If this already made your blood boil, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss stories where justice finally wins." The woman didn't rise. She couldn't. Hours of cold had turned her legs stiff, fingers numb, breath shaking. Her name was Imani, a black nanny who had spent the last 3 nights surviving on cardboard and hope. She held a little girl in her arms, wrapped tight in her thin coat, doing everything she could to keep the child warm. The man towered over her, rage and wealth dripping from his voice. "That's my daughter," he snapped. "Why is she with you?" Imani swallowed hard. Her throat burned from the cold. She was sitting alone outside the school gate. She was freezing. "I didn't want her to." "Don't lie to me," he barked. "Women like you will say anything for sympathy." Imani flinched, not from the cold. She was used to that by now, but from the poison in his tone. "Women like you." She had heard that her whole life. The little girl stirred weakly in her arms, lifting her head. "Daddy, don't yell," she whispered. "She helped me. I was lost. I was cold." The man blinked, breath-catching. "You found her alone?" Imani nodded. "I didn't take anything. I just didn't want her to freeze." His anger faded into shame, slow, heavy, visible even in the dim streetlight. He finally noticed the state she was in. Cracked shoes, trembling hands, a face worn by nights without shelter. He took his daughter gently. "I misjudged you," he said under his breath. "You saved her." Imani didn't reply. She didn't trust her voice not to break. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked quietly. "No, sir, not tonight." He hesitated, then extended a hand, something between guilt and gratitude softening his features. "Please come with me. At least get warm. You shouldn't be out here." Imani looked at the child, then at the man, then at the cold street swallowing the night behind her. She pushed herself to her feet, every muscle aching, and followed them toward the warm car waiting at the curb, unaware that this single moment on a freezing sidewalk was about to change all their lives forever. The mansion's warmth hit Imani like a wave the moment she stepped inside. It almost hurt. After 3 nights of cold concrete and shaking hands, heat felt like fire on her skin. She stood near the doorway, unsure where to place her feet on the polished floor. Everything looked too clean, too bright, too far from anything she had ever touched. The little girl, Lily, rested on her father's shoulder, already half asleep. "Sit," he said gently, pulling out a chair in the kitchen. "You need this." A steaming bowl of soup slid toward her. Imani hesitated, then whispered, "Thank you." She ate slowly, carefully. It had been days since something warm touched her stomach. The man leaned against the counter, watching her without the earlier fire in his eyes. "I'm Carter," he said finally. "I reacted badly." Imani didn't lift her gaze. "You were scared for her. I understand." But her voice trembled, exposing more truth than she intended. Carter studied her, really studied her now. The torn coat, the exhausted eyes, the quiet dignity she held like armor. "How long have you been out there?" he asked. 3 nights, she answered. "Since I lost my job." He frowned. "Why?" Imani paused. The memory burned more than the cold ever had. "The house I worked at, the son claimed I stole something. I didn't. But when a black woman is accused, truth doesn't matter." She didn't cry. She refused to. But her voice cracked just enough of the hurt to slip through. Carter's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Imani gave a small nod. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Upstairs, Lily stirred and reached out, half asleep. "Daddy, where's the lady?" Imani lifted her head in surprise. Carter managed a faint smile. "She means you. She already trusts you." Imani's heart softened despite her caution. Moments later, he returned with a folded blanket. "There's a guest room you can use. Just for tonight. It's warm, it's safe." Imani shook her head instinctively. "I don't want to intrude." Carter stepped closer. You kept my daughter alive in the cold. That's not something I ignore. Silence filled the space, heavy but gentle. Imani finally rose, her legs trembling from exhaustion. Thank you, Mr. Carter. Just Carter, he corrected softly, as she followed him down the quiet hallway. Passing paintings worth more than everything she had ever owned, a strange feeling settled in her chest. Relief, fear, and something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Morning light spilled softly through the Carter mansion's tall windows, brushing against the polished floors and the quiet hallways. Imani walked carefully, still unsure where she fit in this world of marble, oil paintings, and silence that felt rehearsed. She had never woken up in a room so clean, so warm, so still. She stepped into the kitchen, unsure she was allowed to touch anything. A housekeeper, Janice, a stiff white woman in her 50s, turned sharply at the sound of footsteps. "Oh," Janice said, eyes narrowing. "You're still here." Imani froze. "Mr. Carter asked me to stay the night." A tight smile, one glance up and down, one judgment too familiar. Before Imani could reply, light footsteps entered the room. Lily ran straight past Janice and wrapped her arms around Imani's waist without hesitation. "Good morning. Are you staying?" the little girl murmured, rubbing her eyes. Imani knelt and brushed a curl away from Lily's forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart." Janice's expression shifted, annoyance sharpening like glass. Carter entered a moment later, his hair still damp, shirt sleeves rolled. "Morning," he said, eyes moving toward Imani. "Can you stay a little longer today?" "Just until I get some work sorted out." Imani hesitated. "If you need help with Lily, I can." Lily beamed, hugging her tighter. Janice stepped forward sharply. "Sir, with respect, staff protocols don't allow." Carter didn't even look at her. "It's fine. Imani stays." Janice's lips tightened. "Yes, Mr. Carter." Her footsteps echoed angrily as she walked away. Imani stood there, unsure what to say. Carter noticed. "You don't have to feel uncomfortable," he said. "Some people don't like change, or being wrong." His tone implied he wasn't just talking about Janice. Later that morning, a therapist arrived to meet Lily, Dr. Morales, a gentle Latina woman with warm eyes. She sat across from the girl, notebook open. Lily didn't speak, didn't lift her head, didn't respond to anything. Dr. Morales tried everything soft, colors, shapes, simple questions. Nothing, until Imani quietly stepped beside Lily and placed a crayon in her hand. "You can draw whatever you want," she whispered. For the first time in weeks, Lily moved. Slowly, carefully, she drew a small green tree and then a tiny stick figure with curly hair. Dr. Morales looked up at Carter, stunned. "She trusts her," she said, "more than anyone here." A long silence filled the room, heavy, emotional, undeniable. Carter exhaled slowly, a shift in his expression, not just gratitude. Something deeper, something he didn't dare name yet. And from a hallway, Janice stood half hidden behind the doorframe, eyes narrowed, watching. Not pleased, not trusting, not done. This house had accepted Imani, but not everyone inside it had. The afternoon settled over the Carter estate like a quiet fog, soft, gentle, and slightly unsettling. Imani followed Lily into the garden, guiding her toward the old maple tree, where a wooden swing hung low and still. The child climbed into it without a word, her small hands gripping the ropes. Imani pushed the swing gently. "When I was little, I had a tree like this," she said softly. Lily turned her head just slightly. "What did it sound like?" Imani smiled. "It told me I'd get through the bad days, even when I didn't believe it." A flicker of emotion crossed the girl's face. A tiny crack in the wall she'd built around her grief. From the study window upstairs, Carter watched, his reflection layered over the scene outside. The man who had once shouted at Imani now stood perfectly still, his expression caught somewhere between remorse and something softer. Later, Imani stepped to the hallway, carrying Lily's backpack. That's when she passed Carter's office and noticed something she hadn't seen before. The door, always shut tight like a locked memory, was half open. She hesitated. Inside, the room felt different from the rest of the mansion. Darker, heavier. The air smelled of cedar and old paper. Framed documents lined the walls. Photos on the desk face down, as if someone couldn't bear to look at them. Carter entered behind her quietly. She loved this room, he said. Imani turned. Your wife? He nodded once. She died 2 years ago. After that, Lily stopped talking, stopped smiling. I shut the door because I didn't know how to keep anything alive in here anymore. Imani stepped back, not wanting to intrude, but Carter's voice held her there. You brought something back, he said. I don't know how, but you did. Before she could answer, a faint sound echoed outside, a thud, sharp and out of place. Carter straightened. Imani followed him down the hall, to the side window facing the driveway. Nothing moved, but something felt wrong. Off, like the air had shifted. Carter exhaled slowly, probably the wind. But Imani wasn't convinced. Survival teaches a woman to sense the difference between nature and presence. This felt like presence. Later, at dinner, Lily refused to sit unless Imani was beside her. Carter noticed. Janice noticed too, pausing her steps, watching with cold disapproval. Imani, Carter said quietly, I'd like you to stay here. Not just tonight. Longer. Lily needs you. Imani looked down at her hands. Are you sure? Yes, he said simply. Completely. And just like that, the role she never expected became the one this house depended on. But outside the mansion's warm glow, something watched, something patient, something waiting. The calm wasn't calm at all. It was the breath held before the storm arrived. The next morning arrived gray and sharp, the kind of sky that warned something was shifting. Imani helped Lily finish her cereal while the house felt strangely alert, like the walls themselves were listening. Janice entered the kitchen with her usual stiff walk, eyes cutting toward Imani with a blade-thin stare. Mr. Carter, she said loudly, I'm not sure it's safe to let guests roam freely around the house. Imani kept her gaze down, focusing on Lily's spoon. Carter didn't. Imani is not a guest, he said, voice firm. She's here because she's the only person Lily trusts. Janice's jaw tightened. With all due respect. Carter repeated, try starting there. The housekeeper fell silent, but her eyes burned with something uglier than annoyance. Imani had seen that look before, at bus stops, at grocery stores. In doorways she wasn't welcome to cross. Racism didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered. Later, Lily tugged Imani's hand and whispered, Can we play outside? Imani nodded, relieved to step into fresh air. In the garden, Lily giggled softly as Imani twirled her around. For the first time since her mother's death, the child's laughter actually reached her eyes. Carter watched from the terrace, the tension in his shoulders easing a little. You're changing her, he said later, approaching Imani by the rose bushes. She just needed to feel safe again, Imani replied. Carter stepped closer, lowering his voice. And you made that happen. Not therapists, not guards, you. Imani didn't know how to answer that. Before the moment could settle, the gardener, Eddie, hurried from the driveway, pale and out of breath. Sir, I found this near the side gate. He handed Carter a small object wrapped in a cloth. Carter unfolded it. A silver coin, placed deliberately on the stone pathway. Imani's stomach tightened. That wasn't there yesterday, she said. No, Carter muttered, eyes narrowing. It wasn't. Eddie shifted nervously. And someone opened the gas cap on my truck. Didn't take anything. Just opened it. Imani felt a chill, not from the wind, but from recognition. Predators often start small, quiet, testing boundaries. Carter called for extra security, but worry flashed in his eyes. Inside, Imani tried to distract Lily with puzzles, but the child stopped suddenly and rested her small hand on Imani's. Are we safe? She whispered. Imani swallowed, forcing calm into her voice. Nothing will hurt you, I promise. Upstairs, Carter watched him from the landing, a painful truth hitting him. He had money, cameras, a mansion, but safety? That was something Imani, with nothing, had given more freely than he ever had. She wasn't just helping Lily. She was holding the entire house together. And Carter wasn't sure the danger outside was half as frightening as the thought of losing her inside. Night settled over the mansion like a thick blanket. Warm lights glowing behind tall windows, shadows stretching long across the garden. But inside, the air felt different. Protective, awake. Imani tucked Lily into bed, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Will you be here in the morning?" Lily whispered. Imani smiled softly. "I'm not going anywhere." The child clung to her for a moment, tight, trusting. Something Carter hadn't seen in months. Downstairs, Carter waited in the hall, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense with thoughts he wasn't used to saying aloud. When Imani stepped down the stairs, he exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath far too long. "She likes you," he said quietly. "I like her too," Imani answered. "She's stronger than she knows." Carter nodded, then paused. His voice lowered. "Imani, I owe you more than gratitude." Imani raised an eyebrow. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes," he said, stepping closer. "I do. I judged you. I talked to you like you didn't matter. Like your life, your dignity meant nothing. And you still saved my daughter." Imani looked away, fighting back a mix of hurt and forgiveness she wasn't sure she wanted to feel. Carter continued. "When you walked into this house, everything shifted." Lily laughed again. She slept again. She trusted again. "And he hesitated. "I saw the world the way she sees you. Safe." Imani's breath caught. Before either of them spoke again, Janice appeared at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, voice sharp. "Sir, with respect, the staff doesn't feel—" Carter didn't let her finish. "The staff doesn't decide who belongs in this house," he said firmly. "I do." Janice froze. "And Imani stays. Permanently. As Lily's full-time caregiver, if she wants it." Imani blinked, stunned. "Permanent?" "Yes," he said. "A room, a salary, health, stability, security. No one talks down to you. No one decides your worth. You saved my child's life, and you changed mine." Janice's face tightened, but she said nothing. She knew the conversation was over. Imani tried to steady her voice. "Mr. Carter, why me?" "Because you walked into the cold," he said softly, "and gave my daughter warmth I couldn't. And because I trust you, the person I love most in this world." Silence settled, heavy, intimate, honest. Imani lowered her gaze, emotions swirling in her chest she wasn't ready to name. But one thing was clear. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was valued, protected, seen. And for the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel like revenge. It felt like coming home. The next morning rose in gentle gold, spilling through Lily's curtains and warming the room before she even opened her eyes. Imani sat beside her, humming a soft tune, a habit she didn't realize she'd picked up just for this little girl. Lily blinked awake and immediately reached for her hand. "You stayed," she whispered. Imani squeezed her fingers. "I promised I would." Down the hallway, Carter stood leaning against the doorway, watching the scene with a quiet expression, one he hadn't worn since before the grief swallowed his home. Something in his chest loosened at the sight. Something heavy finally let go. Later, as they walked downstairs together, the house felt different, brighter, warmer, alive. Imani hadn't just entered the mansion. She had changed his heartbeat. Carter met her in the kitchen, his voice softer than the morning light. "You know, Lily slept through the night. First time in months." Imani smiled. "She's healing." "You're the reason," he replied. She looked away, humbled. No one had ever said words like that to her, not without expecting something in return. Carter stepped closer, but kept his tone gentle. "Imani, you didn't just save my daughter. You saved this house from staying frozen in grief." He hesitated, choosing honesty over perfection. "I hope you stay for a long time. Not because I need help, but because this feels right." Imani's heart tightened. She wasn't used to being wanted, truly wanted, beyond labor, beyond survival. For once, she didn't push the feeling away. Before she could speak, little footsteps pattered across the floor. Lily ran in and hugged Imani's leg. "Can we make pancakes?" she asked. Imani laughed. "Only if your daddy helps." Carter smiled, an unguarded, warm smile that felt like sunlight after storm. "I think we can manage that." They made breakfast together, messy, uneven, imperfect. Lily spilled flour. Carter burned one pancake. Imani laughed harder than she had in years. And for a moment, no cold nights existed. No sidewalks. No accusations. No fear. Only warmth, safety, and something that felt dangerously close to future. After breakfast, Lily crawled into Imani's lap, wrapping her arms around her. "You feel like home," she whispered. Imani froze, then slowly hugged her back, eyes stinging with tears she'd held for too long. Carter watched, his voice barely above a breath. She's right. The mansion was no longer cold, no longer silent, no longer broken. Because sometimes home isn't a place at all. Sometimes it's the person who never gave up on warmth, even when the world gave her nothing but cold.